And welcome, Hoosier Nation, to our 57th episode of the Hoosier Sound, where our show has one main goal to give you our perspective of IU sports from the point of view as a student or young adult. We are recording this edition of the Hoosier Sound on Tuesday evening, October 9th, where I am your host, Noah Freeman, and I'm with my usual host, Matthew Lukens.
What's up?
Normally, we'll be going live every Tuesday evening at 8:30 p.m., but if you miss us live, you can subscribe to various networks so you can listen on your own time. Check out our Twitter and Facebook at The Hoosier Sound and subscribe. All of the information is in our website, thehoosiersound.com. All right, Hoosier Nation, it is time for some sports talk. But first, I would like to introduce our very special guest for tonight's show, Galen Clavio. He is the Associate Professor of Sports Media and the Director of National Sports Journalism Center at Indiana University. Galen is also the host of CrimsonCast, an IU football and basketball podcast that has been around for nearly a decade. Excuse me tonight. Wow. Galen, how are you doing on this fine Tuesday evening right before homecoming week?
Doing fine, guys. Thanks for having me on. I hope that you're both doing well.
Trying.
Yeah, homecoming week's always a little bit of a challenge, but no, we're making it through. We're looking forward to the game. I'm not looking forward to this change in weather that we're about to have, where it's going to drop like 30 degrees over the course of the next 48 hours. But that's October for you in Indiana.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to be sick by the end of this week. I already know.
Yeah.
I'm like, my body's been like on summer mode. It's like, what is this? 50 degrees?
Buy the NyQuil, buy the emergency. I mean, just get whatever you need in your body right now.
Stock up from the C-store. Yeah.
That's right.
Make sure you're okay to get there for the noon game that's supposed to be like a high of 55 degrees on Saturday.
Lovely.
But before we get to the main part of the show, each week Matt and I do a memorable monologue on what news he saw this past week from the IU sports team. But Galen, why don't we kick it over to you? What have you seen this past week from any IU sports team that has caught your eye?
Well, I mean, I think this time of year, my attention goes to the men's soccer team. They've had a couple of really good things happen to them recently. Obviously, they just pulled in another recruit today. That was, I think, their second or third recruit in the last couple of weeks. They win at Michigan this past weekend. They're number one in the RPI, which is really important as far as seeding is concerned for the NCAA tournament. And currently, they're leading the Big Ten. And they have their basically destiny in their hands because, barring something catastrophic, they still get to play the teams that are the closest to them. So a really good year shaping up for Todd Yeagley and company, trying to get back to the College Cup and try to add a ninth star to the jersey. So I've been really excited about that.
Especially since they've played basically no one but the top tier opponents. So it's helping them get ready for the tournament when it comes around the corner sooner than later.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of Tom Crean's scheduling philosophy when he was in basketball. It's been crazy. No, I mean, their only two losses are to top 5 teams on the road, and one of those was in overtime. They beat North Carolina, who's the new number 1 at North Carolina. Really, really battle-hardened team, and I've enjoyed watching them all season, and I'm really excited about what they might be able to do in the tournament.
I agree. Same here. Matt, let's kick it over to you for a second because I know Matt's got some news. Well, it's not really news because if you were around at all over this past weekend, you would have heard about this.
All right. Well, Sunday, obviously, you guys already know what we're going to talk about, but Samson James committed to IU, the Indiana University. No, we don't have the in front of the name, but the is important because he decommitted from the Ohio State University, which I don't know how often that has happened, but I can guarantee you that it's extremely rare that somebody would flip from OSU football to IU football, especially a top 200 recruit. If you don't know who Samson James is a 6'1" running back. He's 211 pounds from Avon High School in Avon, Indiana. He is currently the 161st prospect in the 24/7 composite rankings, and he's the 10th overall running back in the composite rankings. So needless to say, he is a fantastic recruit. And so asked at his press conference, was it yesterday or today? Tom Allen was asked, did you celebrate? And he said, yeah, you probably could have heard me if you were within blocks of the stadium. And I think that goes for almost any IU fan when we found out A little bit interesting of tidbit about him committing to IU and decommitting from Ohio State. He was actually on an Ohio State official visit this weekend. Didn't get a very good vibe. Obviously saw something he liked from the IU team and said, you know what, I'm going to go there. I'm going to be part of, what Tom Allen is building here in Bloomington. And if you look at the recruiting rankings in Indiana, he's the second best recruit in the state. The other two top 3 recruits we're in for. The one, obviously, everybody knows David Bell. He's a top 100 guy, probably a program changer if we get him. And then Cameron Williams, who's top 300 guy. He's an outside linebacker, also plays in Indiana, where it's between Purdue and us for him, are his top 2 choices. So we're looking like the inside out recruiting isn't just for basketball either. I think it's for football as well.
Yep. Let's move on to the main part of our show. Now we've talked a little bit about some of the other stuff because, of course, this is the middle of football season. So let's talk a little bit about the Ohio State game. Galen, I know you guys obviously have the post-game-esque the next day show for a lot of it. So if you guys haven't listened to that episode, it's great stuff. It's a lot more in-depth reaction to the game on Saturday, but let's get a little bit of perspective from our show. So Galen, what was your initial knee-jerk reaction to the game this past weekend?
It was kind of mixed, I'll be honest. I mean, on the one hand, the team acquitted itself pretty well, particularly on offense. They kept pace with Ohio State through about 2.5 quarters. They really, they put themselves in a situation where they weren't embarrassed in the game. And it was nice to see the passing game opened up. So those were all positive things. And I mentioned this on CrimsonCast earlier in the week. If I had any, I guess, less than positive reaction, it was that I felt like I've seen that game already from this team a few times. I feel like we saw almost a carbon copy of the game from last year, except with Peyton Ramsey at quarterback as opposed to Richard Lego. But I mean, both games, IU aired it out in the passing game. They made it look like it was going to be a game into the fourth quarter, and then Ohio State stepped on the gas and ended up winning comfortably. So I was heartened because I felt we saw more out of the offense for IU in the Ohio State game than really we had at any other point in the season. I just don't know if it means much in the big scheme of things because we saw the same thing out of the offense last year and it didn't really translate.
Yeah. Speaking of offense, let's move into, because you talked about Ramsey. So what do you make of Ramsey's play against OSU compared to the rest of the season? I think it's safe to say most people don't like necessarily how we can't throw the ball 10 yards down the field, but you saw a couple of longer passes completed this game, a few overthrows as well. But how did Ramsey do against a pretty solid, pretty good OSU defense?
Yeah, it's funny to me because what we've heard all season from Ramsey's defenders at quarterback, and because there's been a bit of a controversy about whether he's the best choice under center, all we've heard all season is, he's got a tremendous completion percentage. He's completing 69, 70% or more of his passes. And yet this game, I feel like he's gotten the most praise and he only completed 53% of his passes. But he threw for the most yardage of any game on the year. He threw for the most touchdowns. He threw 3 against Florida International. He threw 3 in this one. And I felt like, there was a way that he was throwing the ball that helped the offense overall, which was that by throwing it deep, it caused the defenders to back off some because they had to worry about Ramsey throwing it over their heads and hitting a wide receiver in stride behind him. That didn't happen every single time. There were still some accuracy issues, but by and large, I felt like that opened a different page on the playbook. I don't know if that's something that we can necessarily blame on Peyton Ramsey versus something we would look at the person who calls the plays, Mike DeBoard, on offense and say, why did we wait until this point to start throwing deep and calling those plays if Ramsey indeed has the ability to do so? So it certainly made it look like, Ramsey is going to be somebody that you can ride the rest of the year if he continues to make those sorts of throws. I think the question is, was that offense that we saw against Ohio State kind of a once a season sort of thing, or do we see that, as what they come out with against Iowa?
Yeah, that's definitely like one of the questions that I have about just the offense in general, which is the quarterback play. because obviously this last game was not indicative of what the whole season's been, which has been 10 to 5 yard, slants or, out routes the whole time. And here we are throwing the ball down the field and trying to pick on some of the OSU's cornerbacks. And we only saw a little bit of Mike Penix in the first game, but it was obvious that he was able to get the ball down the field easier than Ramsey is. So looking ahead into the future, what do you think about that quarterback situation, and how do you think that's going to unfold?
Well, I think as far as this season's concerned, if we were going to see Michael Penix, I think we would have seen him already. I feel like, obviously we saw him a little bit in the Ball State game. This new rule that the NCAA has says you can play in 4 games and still redshirt, as opposed to, not being able to play at all or only be able to play in 1 game. But the problem is that like the easy games, the games you would bring a quarterback in and give them reps, those are kind of gone at this point. Rutgers has come and went, and the Virginia game, obviously because of the rain, probably wasn't the best of situations. It certainly looked at the beginning of the year like there was going to be a bona fide rotation. Now I don't think that's going to be the case. I think their plan is pretty obviously that they're going to redshirt Michael Penix and then I guess start over next year and see what the quarterback competition does at that point. It's going to be interesting because it's going to be progressively harder to unseat Peyton Ramsey as starting quarterback, particularly if he leads this team to like 7 wins, which I think is certainly a possibility given the schedule that's left. But I wouldn't expect any changes at quarterback for the rest of this season.
All right.
Yeah. You talked about, which everyone has talked about for the past few weeks, our offensive coordinator. So into the next question and a lot of his philosophy, I guess. What do you make of DeBoer's philosophy in the last 3 games, specifically in regards to the run game?
Well, I mean, I think if you can derive a philosophy from 3 games, the philosophy seems to be don't run if your offensive line can't block their people. And that seems to, I mean, in the Michigan State game, they gave up on the run very early because there didn't seem to be any way that they could deal with Michigan State's front 4. In the Rutgers game, they did run the ball a decent amount in the second half. It just wasn't successful. And again, I think it was because the offensive line was having a bad day. They did try to run a bit against Ohio State, but they ended up having a lot more success through the air. And Ohio State seemed off anyway defensively. I don't know what would have happened if they tried to run more. Certainly Stevie Scott looked pretty good early on in that game. We didn't see it translate to later on in the contest. So I think what we're seeing right now is an offensive coordinator who doesn't totally trust his offensive line, doesn't totally trust a freshman running back, and doesn't really have anybody else in the backfield that he feels comfortable with, whether that's another freshman in Ronnie Walker Jr., or whether that's some of the more veteran guys like Mike Majette or Ricky Brookings. We saw Mike Majette caught a couple of passes in the Ohio State game, but didn't get a chance really to run the ball. So I really think it probably comes down to that. It's weird to say, oh, it's a conservative offense when they basically just throw the ball all the time, but that's kind of what you got. And the lack of running is almost itself kind of perversely a conservative move because it's high risk, high reward. And rather than, flip the coin on whether Stevie Scott's going to get stuffed for a 3-yard loss or break a 13-yard gain versus throwing a 4-yard slant pattern to, try Ty Freifogel or somebody like that, they're going to tend to opt for the latter, it seems like at this point.
Yeah. Speaking of the running back situation, so I just talked about the kid from Avon, so Samson James, right? He's coming in next year. If you look to next year and you look at the running back room, there's like 5 or 6 guys that have all gotten significant touches. Yeah. So I'm just really confused about what the plan is, because I know there's like depth is great, and depth in anything in any position is awesome. But there's a point in which the depth starts to hurt the team, because then you're putting people in tough spots, especially like people like Ronnie Walker Jr., who hasn't gotten enough touches this year to really like get like the experience that he needs. And then we have this 4-star top 200 running back coming in next year, and that puts him in an awkward position. It was like, I got to get touches. And then you look at Ronnie Brookins and the rest of them. So how do you see the running back room shaping out in the future?
Well, I mean, look, I think part of the issue is there's things you can't predict about what's going to happen with your roster. And look, Indiana is not in a position where they can say, no, we're not going to take you because we feel like we might already have enough people. I mean, look what happened this year. You lose Mike Majette to an undisclosed suspension that still hasn't resolved itself 7 games into the season. He's not
Morgan Ellison.
I'm sorry, Morgan Ellison.
Yeah.
Cole Guest goes out, on the first game of the year. Yeah. And so your top 2 running backs are gone.
Right.
So I look at next year or the year after that, and I say to myself, well, you can't run any risks there. You just bring in as many good players as you want. And look, Indiana has had an embarrassment of riches to some degree at running back over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, whether it's Tevin Coleman or Jordan Howard or even Divine Redding. To me, I think if you're running an offense that's multifaceted, running back is a tremendously valuable position, because if you can bring in guys that aren't just between the tackles, runners, but guys that can get lateral, guys who can go out and catch passes, guys that can, sneak out and be a threat to catch the ball and not just run the ball, that's going to help you, I think, play offense in the Big Ten, because you need those sorts of players with versatility. And, particularly if your IU and your offensive line in the best of years is going to struggle to match up against the defensive line of a Michigan State or a Michigan or an Ohio State, you can't rely on, a 5-step drop and the quarterback sitting back there forever, or even the running game springing you. Like, you're going to have to figure out a way to get the ball out quickly and get it to people who can't, who can break tackles and get downfield. So, so I look at it and say, I can't break down exactly what the room's going to look like, but I think at this point, if you're IU, you collect as much talent and then you figure out what to do with it once you get it. I mean, there should be enough room for all of those guys doing something.
Yeah.
With all of the depth that Matt opened this can of worms already with an Ohio State recap, there was a question that just came in on YouTube that Rob asked, do you think Stevie Scott will go back to linebacker next year with the running back depth?
No, I think Stevie Scott has demonstrated that he's got a role as a running back on this team. And it's one of those things where a guy who's starting and has done a good job. I mean, I feel bad for Stevie because he hasn't had the best of games the last few games. I'm not sure if that's his fault. I think that's as much an offensive line thing. But you look at what Stevie Scott has done over the course of the season so far, and he's rushed for 528 yards, 4 touchdowns. He's averaging just shy of 5 yards a carry. I mean, those are, if they're not starting running back numbers, they're at the very least like, second running back, come in and spell the guy numbers. Even we can look at the Ohio State game when we can say, well, he didn't play that well. Well, 9 carries, 64 yards, and 7 yards per carry. Granted, most of that came on a couple of runs, but that's still pretty good. And I feel like if he was being given more opportunities in a game like that where he's getting good offensive line blocking, he'd do well. So I don't see him moving just because I think he's going to get time to get better at the position. And we'll see what happens. But look, IU, I think when they've done their best at running back, they've had 2 running backs that they're able to rotate relatively regularly. And I could see him and the Samson James, rotating in and out with kind of a thunder and lightning sort of setup like we've seen in the past.
Right.
Yeah. I agree. It was an interesting question, but let's move on to the wide receivers. Both Ja'Shawn Harris and Nick Westbrook got over 100 yards receiving, which for this IU team, it's the first time this season that we had 2 players over 100 yards receiving. The last time that happened was against Purdue at the final game last year. So first time this season that we got 200. We have 2 guys at 100 yards. So it's good to see different people step up in the wake of multiple injuries, to say the least, regardless of how random each game basically is for who is going to be targeted heavily in each game. But Galen, what are your thoughts on the receivers thus far? And what do you think of, I'm going to add Peyton Hendershot, what you think of his performances this season in trying to help replace Ian Thomas at that tight end position?
He threw a lot at me there, so I'll try to answer it. I mean, it's been nice to see Nick Westbrook reemerge in the offense. He had 3 games in a row where only caught 2 balls a game, which to me is kind of criminal underutilization of a really, really good wide receiver. And, you know, but he caught 4 balls against Rutgers. He caught 5 balls against Ohio State. And what was nice is they were balls that Nick Westbrook could do things with. You know, it wasn't like short slant patterns. It was actually trying to get the ball down the field to him. And that's really, I think, a key element of what makes him such a dangerous weapon. So it's nice seeing him, you know, over the past couple of games really emerge. Whether that will stay the same whenever Whop Philyor and Luke Timian get back into the offense, that remains to be seen. But certainly Ja'Shawn Harris has stepped in and has done a lot of really good things. I mean, I think everybody who was on the beat kind of questioned whether we were going to see Harris again after all of the injuries that he's suffered. But, you know, to make an impact like he has on special teams, and then to basically be able to step in and play that possession receiver role, that slot receiver role, and do it as well as he has, I think has been really good to see. And I mean, the whole receiving core, I think, has done an excellent job with what they've had to work with. You know, the offensive attack has been pretty predictable and kind of pedestrian in terms of how a lot of the wide receivers have been used, and yet they've still figured out ways to get open despite being in relatively tight quarters. And they've handled some balls that haven't always been tremendously catchable. You mentioned Hendershot. I think he's showing some promise here. You know, the touchdown he caught against Ohio State was obviously kind of a trick play setup more than anything else. But it's good that somebody has emerged at that tight end position, because I think this offense desperately needs that. That was a real big concern coming into the season, was whether anybody in the tight end core was going to be able to step up. And I think of all the guys, if he's the one that ends up stepping up, that's great news, because he's a redshirt freshman. And, you know, that's a guy that could be a consistent producer for you for the next 3 years.
Yeah, I agree. Let's move on to the defense. We can move to the other side of the ball, because defense, there was a lot. You could take a lot away from this game, but then again, they did give up 49 points. So what is your overall impression on the defensive performance from last Saturday?
Well, last Saturday was not a very good defensive performance for IU. I mean, if you look at the percentile performance from Football Outsiders, it was like in the 11th percentile in the country. And part of that's by, you know, you give up 49 points, you're going to rank pretty low. But the breakout was not very good. I mean, they and I don't blame the defense necessarily, because that's a really tough opponent, and you know, the speed that Ohio State offense has got is really hard to match up with. But, you know, Ohio State on passing downs had an over 50% success rate, on overall in the game had a 50% success rate. They really did an excellent job of just kind of picking the defense apart at their strength, which is secondary. You know, that said, I like the fact that the defense was able to, you know, to get a couple of turnovers, and they didn't back down. They got a couple of sacks. They put some pressure on at various times. I think overall it's been a good year for the defense, in as much as we didn't know how a young IU defense was going to handle the pressures of the Big Ten. And, you know, so far through 3 games, it's been pretty good. And that's what you've come to expect, I think, out of a Tom Allen coach team, because, you know, that's his reputation as a defensive guy. And this is the 3rd defense in a row, I think, that's exceeded expectations.
Yeah, so speaking of the secondary, OSU was like 10 yards off of the single game record for Ohio State passing. So I want to know if that's something that we're going to be looking down the road and being like, oh, the signs were there, or is that just Dwayne Haskins being a Heisman contender?
I mean, it's a combination of Haskins' talent and the fact that Kevin Wilson is a brilliant offensive mind. Yeah. And I mean, he's a guy that he's, you know, I think he understands the, you know, how to scheme properly. He knows how to take advantage of young secondaries, and you know, he and Haskins have a lot of weapons at their disposal. So, right. You know, the thing is, when you look across the board at some of the other teams in the Big Ten, you're kind of hard pressed to come up with other teams that are going to be that good in the passing game as Ohio State is. I mean, you know, I just, maybe I'll eat my words on Saturday evening, but I just have a hard time seeing Iowa passing all over IU. I don't I mean, Penn State's obviously, I think, physical in a very different way, and certainly there's some teams that have some athleticism, but I think that the very few teams have the whole package like Ohio State does in the passing game. So I'm not too worried about it yet.
Okay.
Yeah. And speaking of the secondary, I also, they gave up a lot of passing yards, but I did think it was great how they got 2 picks from Haskins, which doubled his interceptions for the entire season in one game. When he only threw 2 interceptions in 5 games before that. And this IU defense, this really young defense, got 2 picks, which was great to see.
Yeah, I mean, it was nice, not just with the picks, but the fact they got a couple of pressures on him from a defensive line that frankly has struggled a little bit in terms of getting to the quarterback. That's something that has to continue. But you saw there was 1 sack that directly led to an interception, and that was a big deal in terms of forcing some momentum change. Nothing ended up coming of it, unfortunately. But overall, I think that the defensive effort, even though it was bad in terms of the play-to-play stuff, the high-end stuff, the outstanding stuff that we saw, whether it was the sacks or whether it was the interceptions, hopefully that's something that IU can build on as they move forward. They're going to have to, because until the offense consistently demonstrates that it can play fast, that it can play deep, and that it can continually score, you're going to have this defense coming up with stops and putting the team in a position where they can weather storms, when the offense has its problems. I think we saw that against Michigan State, where when the offense really needed it, the defense was able to step up. Keep in mind, in that Michigan State game, I mean, the defense only allowed 28 points. The other 7 points were due to that pick 6 that they got in the first quarter. So
right.
I think there's a lot of good signs with this defense. I think they just got to keep maturing, and they got to stay away from injuries.
Yeah, and we talked about this on our last episode, but this was an Ohio State team that was, I think it was something like, before coming into the game, they were averaging 49.8 or something points per game, and that includes even adding the Penn State game, the top 10 matchup. So they've been scoring a lot. So even with a Tom Allen led defense, they were still going to give up points, and it was like you said, just to echo what you said, they gave up a few plays, but they were also able to step up and at least show promise going into other teams that don't have nearly as explosive of an offense. But let's wrap up the Ohio State game, and I'm going to throw a few things at you. But I wrote down 3 reasons IU could not pull off the game against Ohio State, and then 3 reasons to be excited moving forward. So after I give you my thoughts, let me know what you think, whether you agree or disagree, or if you want to add anything or take away.
Okay.
So 3 things IU could not pull off the game against Ohio State. I think they got tired on both sides. We were only on offense for 23 minutes of possession versus 37 for Ohio State. So it shows that we started, the lead started to go away at the very end of the game when we were only on the field for 23 minutes on the offense. Second reason, we didn't capitalize on every turnover we got. There was only 1 turnover out of 3 that we took away, that we scored any points off of, and we just kind of stalled, especially where 2 of them got into Ohio State territory. And then 3 conversions, 3 for 14 on 3rd down, versus 8 for 16 for Ohio State, and then 1 for 3 on 4th down for IU, and then 3 for 4 for OSU. So let's pause there, and I want to get your thoughts on that.
I agree. I mean, I think injuries took a toll a little bit too, in addition to fatigue. Thomas Allen went down a couple of times. There were a couple other players that went down. It's playing against Ohio State's a very physical experience, and IU does struggle with depth, especially when you compare it to Ohio State. So I would agree with that. I think that the 2 that you mentioned, not capitalizing on fumble or the turnovers, and then also not converting, to me, those are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. And that ultimately ended up being that when there were opportunities, IU had trouble capitalizing on them. And that's just something that it's difficult to do against Ohio State, but it's something that you absolutely have to do if you're going to have a chance in a game like that, because when your opponent is that superior, you just can't afford to make mistakes. And to me, not turning turnovers into points and not converting on third downs. And frankly, even more to the point, consistently getting yourself into third and difficult to convert situations. Those were problems, and those have been problems for a long time for IU. It wasn't just limited to the game on Saturday. Sorry.
Yeah. And let's end on a little bit of a positive note before looking ahead at Iowa. So 3 reasons to be excited moving forward. So 1, this defense can get turnovers, 13 total turnovers, which is the best in the Big Ten. 2, IU shows flashes of football where they can get 7 or 8 wins this season still with their remaining schedule, whether that happens or not. And I think at least all of us, from what I've heard, more likely the latter. But this game is at least showed there are more tools in the coaching staff's toolbox than we have seen so far before Ohio State. And then lastly, more for the future. But this team is really, really young, especially on the defensive end. But Coach Allen is obviously now getting much bigger recruits than we are used to. And to the future, from an optimistic standpoint, it looks bright for the next few years, at least. Hopefully, from an optimistic standpoint, years beforehand.
Now, look, I think as far as this year is concerned, anything's on the table right now. If you look at the projections, IU has a 76% chance of being bowl eligible, and yet the margins for that are relatively thin. There's also a 25% chance they won't be bowl eligible, and so it's one of those things where right now IU, I feel like, has played at about replacement level for what we would have expected given the talent level on the team this year. I wasn't expecting them to beat Ohio State, but I did expect them to win the 4 games that they won, and frankly, by a little bit more than they won them. And so it's just hard to say. I mean, we'll talk about this on CrimsonCast a little later on in the week, but this is a really important Iowa game, and I think that it's probably, it's very similar to the Michigan State game in that it feels like a barometer type of game where this is where we really figure out, what is this IU team made of? How is it that they translate into a game against a decent opponent? As far as the future is concerned, I mean, on the one hand, I agree. There's a lot of reason for optimism with recruiting and so forth. But yeah, I was thinking about this a lot because sometimes I come across as perhaps a little bit jaded, and that's not true. I'm a lot jaded about IU football because I've been watching it for 35 years now, and I'm in the mode where I like Tom Allen a lot. I like what he represents. I think he seems to be a really good guy. The team seems like a really good group of guys, but I'm firmly in the let me see it first and then I'll get excited mode as an IU football fan, because, since Bill Mallory left, we've had, Cam Cameron, Jerry DiNardo, Terry Hepner, Bill Lynch, Kevin Wilson, and now Tom Allen. And there's been 3 bowl appearances in that entire time. And so it's just, you need to see the consistency. You need to see, the team win games that maybe they shouldn't necessarily win, in order to get, the level of excitement that a lot of people already seem to have about the future. So maybe that's just me being curmudgeonly, or maybe it's me just having a lot of experience with dealing with like IU fandom over the course of time.
But speaking of IU winning games, they usually aren't supposed to win games. Let's go into Iowa because on a normal year, you would think Indiana, Iowa. Iowa's a lot of times in the top 25 or at least near that. So you would think at least Indiana on a normal year would not have much of a chance per se to compete against Iowa. So let's move into Iowa. Just a couple things about the game. It's on Saturday at noon. We've got it on ESPN2 for our homecoming game. Out of 3 games in a row that we will be on IU and something a little different. There is a 4.5-point spread for Iowa's favor at the moment. And at the moment, the ESPN matchup predictor for whatever you'll take it at has 71.1% in Iowa's favor compared to 28.9% for IU. Then for this season's resume for Iowa, they beat Northern Illinois, Iowa State, Northern Iowa, Minnesota, and then lost to, at the time, number 18, Wisconsin, 28-17. Iowa is scoring 29.8 points per game and is giving up 16.6 points per game. So, Galen, what can Indiana do to continue this momentum, at least the positive aspects of the momentum from Ohio State, and use it to compete and win against a pretty decent Iowa team.
So Iowa is like a slightly supercharged version of Indiana, I think, in that they have a really pedestrian offense and a really, really good defense. And I think you can make an argument that their defense overall is better than Michigan State's defense, particularly this year. And in fact, the advanced metrics bear that out, that Iowa's defense overall has played better. Here's the thing with Iowa. They're a team that, really has thrived on field position for their offense. It's what's put them into positions where they've been able to do things effectively. They've thrived on being able to keep their opponents from doing almost anything worthwhile in the passing game. And, and they've won games handily. They from the standpoint of, Iowa State, they only won by 10, but they only let Iowa State score 3 points all game. And that's not a terrible Iowa State team. They won a track meet at Minnesota, and most people didn't think that they'd be able to do that. The game that they lost to Wisconsin, they were leading that game relatively late. I mean, Wisconsin ended up figuring out a way to win at the very end. And then you look down the road, this Iowa team legitimately could look at their schedule and say, guys, we might lose at Penn State, but we might win every other game on the schedule. Like a 10-win season is frankly quite within reach for this Iowa team. But that said, I wouldn't look at any aspect of Iowa and say that it is, unbeatable or untouchable. They have a fairly good quarterback in Nate Stanley, and defensively, they've got, some guys I think that collectively have made some good plays. Anthony Nelson's got 5 sacks on the season. H.E. Epineza has 4 sacks on the season. But, outside of that, you're not looking at a group of players where any one is like a tremendous standout. So I think to answer your question, if IU is going to win this game, they have to come out and not make mistakes first and foremost. They can't afford to not convert on third down. They can't afford to, if they, first off, they have to generate turnovers. They can't afford not to capitalize on the turnovers. And they have to figure out a way to get the running game, the short passing game, and the long passing game, all 3 phases of the offense going simultaneously. I think it's within Indiana's reach. Indiana's got enough talent to do it. I think a lot of this is psychological as much as anything else. This idea that Iowa goes into a game like this, even on the road, and expects to win. I don't know if IU goes into this game expecting to win. And I hope that's, that we see a change in that. But what we've seen over the course of the last few years is games like this, whether they're at home or on the road, IU goes in, they compete until like the fourth quarter rolls around, and then they gradually wilt. And it ends up being a situation where we all sit around saying, darn, that was so close. And, it feels like we've done that every year, 2 or 3 times a year. I think the change for that has to come internal to the team. It has to come with the coaching staff, making the team believe that, indeed, you can win this game. And Iowa, even though they might have a really good defense, they're not materially that much better than you are, and you're playing at home.
Yeah. Let's get into some more talk about Iowa specifically. So from some of the stuff I've seen from them, they're a pretty balanced offense. Their passing and rushing are very similar. They use a lot of players in each position. They've scored 9 touchdowns in both passing and rushing. So this offense is very balanced. But specifically to the QB, Nate Stanley is the Iowa QB. He's nowhere near the caliber QB that IU just saw with Haskins, but that's a little different because Haskins is potentially a Heisman contender at this point. But Stanley has a 61.7% completion percentage for 1,153 yards, 230 per game. He's got 9 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. Keep in mind, Iowa has had their bye, so they've only played 5 games at this point. He's not much of a running quarterback. He's only rushed. I put rush in quotation marks just because sometimes they count sacks and stuff like that as rushing, but he's only rushed 14 times for 9 yards. So what do you see in Stanley, Galen, for compared to some of the other quarterbacks Indiana has faced so far this season?
I mean, I think he's just a steady presence, and that's important in a quarterback. I don't think that he's anything spectacular. I mean, you look across the board at what he's done. His completion percentage, if you take out the Northern Iowa game, is pretty pedestrian. He's not throwing. He's thrown for a decent amount of yards the last couple of games, and he certainly had a great game against Minnesota. But Minnesota's got a pretty suspect defense. But even you go back and look at last year. This is a guy that just wasn't being asked to throw the ball a tremendous amount, and frankly didn't complete that many balls. Like last year, he had 2 games where he completed 20 or more passes. And this year, he's only had 2 games where he's completed 20 or more passes. Mm-hmm. So I think his big thing is he doesn't make a huge number of mistakes, and he doesn't get sacked. And part of that's because his offensive line is very good at keeping him from getting sacked. I think his sack rate's like under 3% on the season, which is very, very good. But he's efficient, in that he doesn't complete passes at a high, the same level as say Peyton Ramsey does, but he doesn't get sacked. And he doesn't put himself in a position where he's taking things off the table for his team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like it. Running backs. So Iowa's got 3 different running backs who have about 50 carries. So you can already see that you got 3 people with almost exactly 50 carries each. So they really use 3 different running backs, which is not something you see all the time, even in college football. But Torrin Young, Mekhi Sargent, and Ivory Kelly Martin are the 3 running backs that are that will run a lot for Iowa. Torrin Young has the most yards out of all 3 at 286 in total, which is 5.3 yards per game. And Mekhi Sargent has the most touchdowns at 4. So these are like a 3-headed monster kind of thing. None of them have caught anything out of the backfield very much. Mekhi and Ivory have both caught 2 and 3 passes for about 50 yards. So if they do catch anything in the backfield, they make it count. But really, I think I saw it was only out of all 3 of them, that's like 6 or 7 passes out of the backfield that they'll catch.
Yeah, it's an interesting group. And it is very much a by committee approach. They're all very young. They're all sophomores. They don't, none of them, look at and say, wow, that's a great running back. I mean, Torrin Young, he's got a relatively good average yards per carry. He's averaging about 5.3 yards per carry. Once they get hit, they tend to go down. There's not a lot of yards after being hit. None of them are particularly explosive. None of them have fumbled the ball. They've done a very good job of hanging on to the ball. And they're just kind of part of this unspectacular Iowa offense that just kind of grinds out yards and grinds out points. And, I wouldn't be shocked if none of them exceeded 60 yards in this game. I think that IU's done a fairly decent job of bottling up the run. And I think, that might end up being part of the plan is, if you could take the running game away and force Nate Stanley into passing situations, that at least takes something off the table for this Iowa offense and forces them to do something that Minnesota game notwithstanding, maybe they're not that comfortable with doing.
Yeah, so I got a question going off of that. So Ohio State ran for 48 times for 154 yards against us. And then Iowa against Minnesota ran for, I think it was like over 120, 130 yards against Minnesota. So I got a question. So I know that OSU's offensive line, they're beasts. Like, they're fantastic. But I want to know if Iowa's offensive line is going to get that push into the second level in order to get Iowa running backs maybe the same amount of yards that they did, like OSU did against us.
I mean, it's a good question because, if you look at the they ran for 106 yards against Minnesota, but it was only an average of 2.65 yards per rush, which is very, very bad.
Right.
And again, Minnesota's secondary seems to be pretty susceptible to things. I'm not sure if Minnesota's defensive line is suddenly good, but no, I don't think Iowa. You got to keep in mind, Iowa doesn't recruit that differently than Indiana does. I mean, you're talking about more or less the same caliber of player. Iowa, I think, has historically done a better job across the board of developing that talent, or maybe spotlighting the type of talent that's going to be good in the Big Ten. But Ohio State, it's like a group of aliens beamed down and put on scarlet and gray jerseys. I mean, they're very different physically from most of the other teams in the Big Ten, maybe similar to Penn State and Michigan, but Iowa is more like playing other mortals. And so I don't think there'll be any huge advantage from an offensive line perspective for the Hawkeyes in this game.
All right.
I like playing other mortals. That's a good,
A much better chance of victory when you're playing other mortals.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not playing the Monstars from Space Jam.
It's basically what the teams in the college football playoff are. It's nuts.
Oh man.
Which that's a whole other discussion for another time in itself. But receivers, like I mentioned, the receivers are almost just as good as the running game because they're very, very, very balanced. But they've got 5 receivers with double-digit receptions, but that's basically almost only who they use exclusively. The only people after that they've had 1, 2, or 3 catches. But those 5 guys are T.J. Hawkinson, Noah Fant, the tight end, and Nick Easley. Those 3 are the main guys out of those 5 receivers. Noah Fant is the big guy, literally, with 5 of 9 passing touchdowns going to him. So what are you seeing from this receiving core? How do you think with the secondary that gave up obviously 10 yards shy of the Big Ten single game passing yards, what do you see with these receivers versus how our younger secondary is matching up against them?
Well, the problem that I see potentially for IU here is that both Fant and Hawkinson are listed as tight ends. They're both big. I mean, Fant's 6'5", 241, Hawkinson 6'5", 250. And the thing about IU is that, because of the system that they play, this kind of hybrid, the Husky position and playing what's in effect kind of 5 defensive backs, it may not be perfectly suited for playing really big targets like this. And so I do worry a little bit about, how are they planning on covering these guys? How does IU handle, trying to tackle guys that big? Because normally it'd be like, hey, let's just stick a linebacker on them. And yet IU's linebacking core is both thin because there just aren't that many top-level linebackers. And, it's not a particularly huge linebacking core by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, TD Roof is 5'11", 224, which means he's giving up 6 inches and 25 pounds to either of those tight ends. Damian Willis is 6'1", 225. Marcelino Ball, who's probably going to get called into action, is 6 foot 222. I mean, I'm looking down the list, Raekwon Jones is 235. Thomas Allen is 236. Their tight ends outweigh some of the defensive linemen. Like Alan Stallings, the 4th, is only 6'2", 247. So I think my point being made here is that I think that's going to be a huge task for IU with guys that are obviously targets, like favorite targets of Nate Stanley, people that he feels comfortable with throwing the ball to on a regular basis. How does IU scheme to handle those guys while also trying to take Nick Easley into account, trying to take some of the wide receivers that are also out there, whether it's Smith Marset or Brandon Smith, into account. It's going to be really tricky. I think this is going to be, quite honestly, maybe one of the bigger challenges Tom Allen has had so far this year in trying to scheme his pass defense around the types of players that he normally doesn't have to defend.
Yeah, I agree. You were talking about really big guys. I wasn't able to go to the Ohio State game, so I watched it on TV, obviously, and they had a little clip that showed the Ohio State offensive line with just how big they were. And obviously Iowa's, we've talked about already how Iowa's offensive line is really good, but the Ohio State offensive line, I don't think anyone's going to get as big as 6'6", 6'7", 6'7", 6'4", and 6'7" for weights of 319, 315, 310, 308, and 310. So that they're just
Monstars.
The Monstars, literally almost exactly the same height, same weight.
Yep.
But this offense, they can turn the ball over. They've given up 3 fumbles and 5 interceptions. So I think at least if statistics wise, if patterns hold, this defense can still get a few turnovers. Now, whether or not they capitalize on it and that can be game changing will be a different story. But especially with the secondary, because we like to get more interceptions than fumble recoveries. So maybe we can try and get some more pressure like we did against Ohio State, get some more pressure on Stanley, make him move around more because he doesn't like to move and start running the ball, get out of the pocket. He'll just throw it and then hopefully make a bad decision.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's going to be interesting watching whoever wins the turnover battle, because that might end up, being the solution to the game. I mean, IU is +4 in turnover margin, and Iowa is +1 in turnover margin. But the statistics basically say that IU has gotten lucky to have collected that many turnovers and to not have committed more themselves. And I think if you look at the way that the games have gone, I mean, there's been more than one example of passes that Peyton Ramsey's thrown up that probably should have been intercepted that weren't. Whether it was, I think there was a Virginia game, there was one in the FIU game, there was one in the Ohio State game. So, the turnover battle is going to be really interesting. I think the question of whether IU's defensive line can get pressure is going to be a big one. And yeah, I think the key is largely what sort of success will IU's defense have on first and second down, because the one thing that Iowa really does well, if you look at the stats, is they put themselves in really good position for third down distance. They're facing a lot of third and relatively shorts, and if you can get them out of that and make them face, instead of a 3rd and 3 or 3rd and 4, if they're having to face consistently like a 3rd and 8 or 3rd and 9, just those 4 or 5 yards are going to end up being probably a huge difference in terms of what all IU is able to do in this game.
Yeah. Let's move over to the defensive end so we can wrap this episode up relatively soon. But they've got a good run defense, this Iowa defense. They only allow 84.4 yards on the ground per game. The most an opposing running back rushed, a single running back rushed, was Jonathan Taylor from Wisconsin at only 113 in their game against Iowa. But otherwise, really, their top rushers have rushed for only 40 to 70 yards at most per game. Speaking of the run defense, how can Stevie get going when, one, he's going up against another good run defense like Michigan State, and two, he isn't getting he isn't getting a lot of carries, and three, the offensive line hasn't been producing or opening holes the past 3 games?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that Mike DeBoer can abandon the running game as quickly as he's done against Iowa. I mean, their numbers are somewhat skewed in that, of the 5 games they played, Northern Iowa was one of them, and Northern Iowa rushed 21 times for 6 yards. Now, some of that was quarterback scrambles and so forth. Iowa State rushed 25 times for 19 yards. It's got to be a situation, I think, whether it's Stevie Scott or whether it's Ronnie Walker or whether it's somebody else, where IU just makes a commitment to not just running the ball, but figuring out ways to loosen up the running game, whether that is Reese Taylor on jet sweeps, or whether that is, trap blocking and running outside of the tackles and figuring out ways to utilize misdirection. What they can't do is just run the ball up the middle a bunch of times, not have success, and then have the only rushing attempts the rest of the way be Peyton Ramsey scrambling because a pass play broke down. So, look, I mean, Stevie Scott obviously has to hang on to the football, but I think more than anything else, he's got to lower his head and, pound out 5-6 yards a carry. If he's able to do that, I think that could help to unlock the defense quite a bit. What'll probably end up happening is the opposite, where they're going to try to use the short passing game to open up the running game. I'm not sure it's going to be particularly successful, but I would anticipate that that's what they'll try to do.
Yeah, I agree. A little more stats about the rest of the defense overall. Jack Hawkeyes leads the team in tackles with 33 total tackles. Anthony Nelson, a big defensive end, has 5 sacks total, which is the most in the Big Ten as an individual. And he's tied, I think, in the top 20 for total sacks out of the nation, which really the top player in the nation for total sacks is 7. So really he's not far off of it. So big guy, 291 or something like that coming off as a defensive end. They have a total of top of the Big Ten. So really our offensive line needs to have a good game to keep Ramsey from scrambling too much. In terms of turnovers, they've gotten 3 fumble recoveries, and for interceptions, I'll put this in quotes. They kind of have 2 interceptions, but you make it 6 against Minnesota just because Minnesota threw 4 interceptions in that game.
Yeah, I mean, Look, the whole thing's an interesting matchup. To me, like, the biggest aspects of this game, the ones I'm most interested in are they really come down to of two offenses that are, bottom 30% in the NCAA, maybe bottom 40%, and two defenses that are probably top 25, top 30%. That's a lot of leverage going each direction. History would tell us that Iowa is normally better at turning those sorts of games into victories, but this is the sort of game that changes culture. And I think with all of the individual stats you're talking about, I think they're all really interesting. From a whether it's a passing situation or a running situation for IU, there just has to be some level of success more than what they had against Michigan State. And to me, like, that's the big comp game in terms of what you would expect out of this IU team. And I think we could all agree, like, a lot of the phases you're talking about here, the effort just wasn't good enough really on either side of the ball in that game. So how does IU fix that going up against an opponent that is probably slightly less talented than Michigan State, but has played better football so far this season?
Yeah, I agree. Great points. Let's wrap up the episode with, we got a couple questions on Twitter. So Josh on Twitter asks, are you labeling the Iowa game as a must win, in quotes, as I am? I think this may be the first pivotal game in Allen's tenure if the Hoosiers truly want to win. #breakthrough.
I say it's a must win. I think, and look, I don't think it's the first pivotal game of Allen's tenure. I think that the first pivotal game was probably the Michigan game last year. And I think you could have thrown the Michigan State game last year, the game at Maryland last year, and the Michigan State game this year. I think those have all been pivotal games, and they've lost all of them so far. Like any game, frankly, where it's a 50-50 game in the conference, particularly if it's slightly less than 50-50, but you've got home field advantage, as IU does in this game and had in certainly the Michigan State game this year and Michigan last year. Those are games IU has to start winning. And, I think the numbers, 4.5 points, I think you said the spread was, ESPN's got it at about a 70-30 split. I think S&P Plus has it at about a 60-40 split. I mean, that's close enough on the margins that if you're IU playing at home, it's not like you're playing a top tier team. And if you're a team that's really trying to compete for, something more than the Little Caesars Bowl or whatever they're calling it, this is the sort of game you have to win. And so to me, it's not a must win in that if they lose the game, they're not going to make a bowl. Because I think they'd really have to fall on their face at this point to not make a bowl, which is still in play. But I mean, I think that it's more likely than not they're going to get to 6 wins. But from a standpoint of like demonstrating momentum and demonstrating that you can actually play at that next tier, not the top tier of the conference, but just the middle tier of the conference, you have to win games like this against unranked teams at home. If they're unranked, I don't care how relatively good they are. That should be in your wheelhouse.
I agree. Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. If IU loses this game, they just basically go back to their normal IU self, barely possibly making a bowl game, barely missing it. It's not necessarily a breakthrough that we've all seen. If we want this team to really break through, this is a must win because, like you said, we need to get to that next tier, and this is one of the wins that we typically don't actually win. So I agree. The last question, Rob on Twitter, would you consider the commitment of Samson James program changing? Speaking of program changing things.
No, because I mean, there have been other 4-star recruits that they've had both in Tom Allen's tenure and also beforehand. I think it's great. I think anytime you can flip an Ohio State recruit, that's great news for the program. So I'm not trying to downplay it, but I think that I think almost all program changing recruiting happens in retrospect. Like everybody thought that Gunnar Kiel was a program changing recruit when he was recruited. He ended up not even coming to IU. Now I'm sure Samson James is going to show up in Bloomington. He's going to end up being a fine 4-year player for this IU team. But, from the standpoint of recruiting hype, to me, IU's in a place where you have to be able to look back retrospectively 4 years later and say, wow, that was an incredible recruit that we got. Now, I mean, I'll give you guys an example. This is well before your time, but like to me, the program changing recruit for the Bill Mallory era was a guy that most people haven't heard of named Dave Schnell. Dave Schnell was a 4-star quarterback out of, I think he was out of Elkhart or Mishawaka. And he was a guy that, big programs are interested in, but he came to IU and he was a dynamite starter for this IU team for 3 years. He led them to the Peach Bowl. He led them to the Liberty Bowl. He added this incredible amount of zip to the offense. And there had been other good recruits that had happened during that time, but that was a guy where once he started playing, it changed the momentum of things. And so to me, I think the Samson James thing is great. I love it. I just, like what I said earlier, I need to see it on the field before I get overly juiced about it as far as my overall attitude towards football.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Galen, for taking time out of your day to come on to our show. When is the next CrimsonCast episode, and how can people find you on Twitter if they would like to start following you and listening to you guys?
Well, first off, thanks to you guys for having me on. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, and I hope that you continue on with this podcasting odyssey that you're on. I've been doing it for about a decade plus now, and it's a lot of fun. I think we're probably going to end up recording the next CrimsonCast Thursday. We might do it live. We might tape it. I might have an extra guest besides my co-host, Scott Caulfield. I might not. Things are up in the air right now. But it'll almost certainly be available in podcast form on Friday. You can actually certainly follow our Twitter feed at CrimsonCast. All of our podcasts appear on the Heard on the Hoosier podcast feed, which is tied to the Indiana Rivals site, thehoosier.com. So be sure to subscribe to that, and you'll get our podcast delivered right to your phone.
Well, folks, that about wraps it up for our 57th show of The Hoosier Sound. Thank you all so much for joining us. Stay tuned through updates on Twitter at The Hoosier Sound, Facebook, and subscribe to us on YouTube, as well as visit our website, thehoosiersound.com, so you can find all of our information regarding our podcasts all in one place. As always, send us your questions as the audience, so be sure to comment, chat, or send us a message at contact@thehoosiersound.com on what questions you have, and we'll get them on our next episode. Lastly, if you enjoy our show, leave us a review, tell a friend, share our links. It really, really helps so we can try and grow this podcast. But as always, thank you for listening, Hoosier Nation, and we'll see you next time.
Peace.